Hi there. In this video, we're going to go over Jungian Archetypes Explained. My name is Christopher, and let's get right into it, shall we? So a couple of different places that I gathered some information from are Carl Jung's autobiography, Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, Ego and Archetype, The Interpretations of Fairy Tales by von Franz, and The Hero with a Thousand Faces by none other than Joseph Campbell. And if you'd like any of those books, I have linked them in the description down below, so feel free to check any of those out. So this is the overall structure of the psyche. I've made a video on this if you want to check that out as well. But today we're going to be talking about archetypes down here. And I have in potentia in the quotation marks, which is it means the archetypes are in potential, meaning that they're in the depths of the psyche waiting to come into conscious awareness. And so this is what we're going to be focusing on today. So to kick us off a little bit, I want to kind of put into context a little bit more about what the archetype is and kind of the irony that you and I are up to here today. So in terms of Jung's concept, every archetype in its essence is an unknown psychic factor, and therefore there is no possibility of translating its content into intellectual terms. And that's from von Franz's book. That's one of the very first pages of her book. And here we go, attempting to intellectualize and understand a conceptual understanding of the archetype, which by its very nature is impossible to do. So let's jump right into it, shall we? So what is an archetype? The way I like to look at archetype is an organizing principle, an image, which is embedded in all human psychic processes. That means it's coming from the collective. When I explain archetypes to people, I typically like to hint at this idea that archetypes are like blueprints. They're a way that the natural psychic energy formulates within the psyche, and there's sort of these rigid patterns that energy flows when it comes to coming from the depths of the psyche. Energy isn't just flowing at these random sort of ways. There are like grooves that the energy has learned to follow, just like a river has learned to go through a canyon. It gets a lot easier for that energy to flow when there's a deeper rut, and these are those deep energetic patterns that allow opening for the psyche to naturally have that energy flow. I like to look at archetypes much like laws of nature. Archetypes are a law in the sense that like with gravity, for example, gravity is a great metaphor for an archetype in the fact that we can see the effects of gravity, but we can never actually see gravity itself. So we can see that when we drop an object, that it falls to the ground. And because of that, we can make the assumption that there must be this force called gravity that exists there. Same with an archetype. With an archetype, we have to make the same observation of the areas around the archetype. We can never actually see the archetype itself through an intellectual lens, much like a black hole. We can never actually see the center of the black hole because it is so powerful that it sucks all the light in. So all we can see is the light that surrounds the black hole. We can never actually see the black hole itself. The same way we can never actually see the archetype itself, we can see the ring of light around it. Archetypes are these stories that make up our lives, individual and collective. These are the arcs, the narratives that we live by. So some qualities, like we just mentioned, they're universal and collective. They exist across all humans. For instance, the archetype of the dragon. The dragon emerged in several different cultures all over the world, and it didn't pop up because of one culture dominating another. It just popped up in the psyche. Like, what is that? How do we all have this mythic sort of archetypal essence of a dragon inside of us? So that's because of this idea that we all carry within us these energetic psychic structures that are embedded within the human psyche. Another important concept to understand here is that all archetypes contain image, emotion, and feeling, and that's how we get to experience the archetype. And that's what the archetype is it's an archetypal experience of what's happening. We're all living archetypal stories in some ways. And so if we can learn to read myth, we can learn to read different aspects of our story. Another quality, which we'll be discussing a little bit more later on at the end of this video, is that all archetypes contain all other archetypes. Archetypes have a feeling of the numinous. They are out of the ordinary, and this can happen at events like weddings, or it can happen at sporting events like the wedding. There's a marriage, a union of opposites. We also have at sporting events the war, like battle scenes, the stories behind the players and the teams, the two players going at it. There's an archetypal image in a dance that's happening when we watch sporting events as well. And then archetypes, once again, cannot be understood intellectually, yet here we are doing what we can as mere mortals trying to understand things intellectually. So what is an archetype? To von Franz, every archetype is a relatively closed energetic system, the energetic stream of which runs through all aspects of the collective unconscious. An archetypal image is not to be thought of as merely a static image, for as always, at the same time, a complete typical process, including other images in a specific weight. So an archetype is very dynamic. Now, when we understand archetypes, we need to understand the developmental story or the myth or the archetype of the development of our brain as well. So the last common ancestor that we had with reptiles was about 320 million years ago. And that was just from a quick Google search. So it could be less accurate, but basically the point is that we at 320 million years ago had the brain of a lizard. And what that meant is that our ancestor at that time only had the ability to sort of react to the world in a very survival way. We were cold-blooded creatures, meaning that we were constantly seeking different forms of temperature through the external world. We were constantly at the whims of things going on around us. Our brains were basically focused on fight, flight, survival, freeze, and it was really just sort of encapsulated in that. Now, 6 million years ago, our last common ancestor was the monkey, and the monkey is a mammal, and so we can start to see in our brain the development and the emergence. This happened earlier, but in the mammalian ancestry, but to just acknowledge that our last common ancestor with another mammal was 6 million years ago, that we developed our limbic system, the mammalian brain, which now allows for us to experience emotion. And when I'm watching my dog fall asleep and start to make noises, and I can see that she's dreaming, she's making this little chirping noises, she's growling sometimes, that I believe that my dog is dreaming at that point. And so what we can maybe deduce from that is that there at the limbic system could be some flashes of visions or insights of dreams as well. Now, we can definitely make that deduction 500,000 years ago when that process isn't just happening in the unconscious. Now there's a way that our ancestors in the Paleolithic era were able to start taking these unconscious images that were occurring in the brain and placing them into the conscious world. We are now able to understand the world in these images, as we can see by cave paintings and other artifacts and art that we have from our ancestors as well. And what's really important to understand here is that there's this split that occurs between our thinking brain and our pre-thinking brain. By thinking brain, I mean having the ability to have structured thought. And that is that before structured thought, our brain existed on top of emotional, psychic imagery and processing for survival. So thinking is built on top of previously existing structures. Our thinking is built on top of image, feeling, sensation, dreams. That is all existing below our thinking mind. I don't even like using below, but in conjunction with our thinking mind. Our thinking mind is built on top of these processes. Without these processes, we wouldn't be able to have a thinking mind. And that's what's so important to understand about the archetypes, is these archetypes had to exist at a point of one of our common ancestors that we all existed and emerged from, and help us to understand how. If they don't help us understand, they are these basic psychic foundational principles in our mind that give us meaning and allow us to understand and think in a way that our prefrontal cortex can do today. So another way to gaze at this same structure is we can see that if each one of these lines represents a layer of the psyche, that we have at the bottom here the animal layer or the primal layer of the brain, then we have the collective, which all humans share, and then we have the personal or the individual level, which is the molding of the collective into our personal lives based off of our individual experiences, our cultures, our upbringings, things that have happened to us in our life. Now, with archetypes themselves, we have them sort of existing at this level down here with the images. And as we'll see in a second, sort of with the idea of a lava lamp, we can see that the archetypes exist right here where the images are originally created, and they will flow between the collective into the personal, giving us an understanding and experience of the archetypal realm. So we can see that right here at the cusp of the animal and the collective, we have the archetype. And so with that image of the lava lamp, we can see down here that if this is the animal structure down here at the very bottom, that right here we have the collective level, and then the archetypes are like these amorphous blobs that are sort of just floating up, affecting our life at the individual and conscious level, and then returning. And we can see down here the impotentia, that they're waiting down here in this soup, in this muck, And it's like these unconscious processes then just emerge up, and they emerge up in different shapes and sizes. Some are just like these small little bubbles. Some are these like huge blobs of psychic material. So I think the lava lamp is an awesome way to understand that. So how can we observe archetypes? So according to von Franz, fairy tales are the purest and simplest expression of the collective unconscious psychic processes. So how can we observe archetypes? So we can observe archetypes in myth, fairy stories, epics, dreams, and then the idea of gravity, that we don't actually see the archetype itself, that we see sort of the light that surrounds the black hole. We see the object falling, and then we can say that there is an archetype there. We'll kind of get a feel for how we can start doing that in a second here. But basically, Jung had a way of understanding fairy stories, according to von Franz. She says that Dr. Jung once said that it is in fairy tales that one can best study the comparative anatomy of the psyche. In myths or legends or any other more elaborate mythological material, we get the basic patterns of the human psyche through a lot of cultural material. But in fairy tales, there's much less specific cultural conscious material, and therefore they mirror the basic patterns of the psyche more clearly. So the reason that this is very important to bring in is that fairy stories or fairy tales, however you like to say that, are the basis of showing the psychic processes. And you may be thinking, how in the heck can a fairy story be showing us complex psychic processes? And if we can remember back to that black hole image, we can understand that the black hole can never be seen in the same way the archetype can never be seen. However, with the fairy story is the light around the archetype. The fairy story are the images, the sensations, the emotions, the experience around the archetype itself. And that's how we experience the archetype, is through our intuition, through our emotional body, through images, not necessarily through our intellectual and conceptual understanding. And so archetypes are more of an experience, a felt lived experience, living the life of these particular archetypes. What's it like to live the archetype of being human, for example? So acknowledging here that fairy stories have less cultural baggage than myths. And not to say that myths aren't also useful in understanding the psyche, for instance, like the Odyssey, but the Odyssey itself has the cultural baggage of Greek culture. It's using the Greek gods, whereas fairy stories don't necessarily have that. They typically talk about, for instance, like there was a woman in the woods who looked up and saw a castle. Now, we don't need any cultural understanding to understand any of those images, and all those images can affect each one of us specifically. And even as I started telling that story, those images probably started coming to you, and there was a story that was being created. So we can also not discuss archetypes without talking about Joseph Campbell's work. So Joseph Campbell was a professor, and he basically found that there is a theme or a common mythic structure that is found today in various cultures and religions. He noticed in creation stories and different myths that there are similarities in the way that stories are told, even though these cultures had no way of talking with each other, that they were separated by thousands of miles of land. And so he started to study this, and he started to recognize that there are different parts of each journey. Typically, many of the stages of the journey start with a call to adventure, a refusal of the call, crossing of the threshold, and then we get into trials and tribulations, and then hopefully eventually the return with the elixir as well back into the community, and thus creating a spiral coming back to the exact place that we started. And this idea of a universal narrative template is what is known as the monomyth, or the story that there is one archetypal mythic structure that exists in all stories and exists in our stories as living, breathing humans as well. Joseph Campbell said that dream is the personalized myth, the depersonalized dream. Just sit with that image for a second. Dream is the personalized myth. Dream is our personal myth. What is going on with us that is also happening at the collective level, because myth is the depersonalized dream. Both myth and dream are symbolic in the same general way of the dynamic of the psyche, but in the dream, the forms are quirked by the peculiar troubles of the dreamer, whereas in myth, the problems and solutions shown are directly valid for all mankind. Once again, dream is the personalized myth, the depersonalized dream. Common examples of archetypes: we have the hero, we have the mentor, the trickster, the great mother, the villain. So the hero is someone who embarks on a journey, faces challenges, and ultimately triumphs over adversity. And I don't want to go into the definitions of each of these necessarily, because the hero may mean something completely different to you as well. These are just common examples of different themes that heroes have. But when we think of, for instance, the mentor, in our mind, we can instantly see images associated with mentorship. We can see the idea of the mentor. We understand from an archetypal standpoint the purpose that the mentor serves inside of us, and there is almost like a key and a lock that clicks into our psyche when we see in the external world, quote unquote, this idea of the mentor. Now, what we're doing in those moments is we are projecting unconscious archetypal material onto the external world. And so what we want to do is we want to reclaim those and understand that these are our psychic processes, because that individual that you see as a mentor out in the world is also a human being who has their own shadow, their own baggage going on. They're also a human. And if we only see them as mentor, we are in a fantasy. We are not seeing reality as it really is. And so it's important that we reclaim those unconscious materials and own them and bring them back into ourselves. And so we have this with all of these, and all these archetypes exist inside of us. We all have the capacity to be the savior and the villain, yet we do not want to identify with any of these. Words of caution: do not identify with the archetype, which is known as ego inflation. We are not the gods. We are not Zeus, the great healer, the mother, or even the hero. That's really important to understand, because we don't want to identify with any of them, because we are mere mortals, and the gods, as we have seen in Greek mythology, will destroy mortals who try to be like them. We are not the archetypes themselves, yet they are a part of us. And therein lies paradox. And so in order to understand archetypes a little bit more, I'm going to bring to you a little story here from von Franz's book to sort of articulate how archetypes exist within all the archetypes, and also how we can start amplifying the images of archetypes. So this here is the archetype of the great tree. So I'm going to read a passage to you. Perhaps just sit back and relax and watch as these images transform on the screen to better understand sort of the archetypal process in working with archetypes. So von Franz says, let us take the motive of the tree, for example. Let us assume that I'm an investigator who has a tree complex. So I will say, start with that. Being emotionally fascinated by it, I shall say, oh, the sun myth and the tree myth are connected. For in the morning, the sun is born in the east out of the tree. There is, for instance, the Christmas tree, and every Christmas tree gives birth to new light at the moment of winter solstice. So all sun myths are, in a way, also tree myths. But then the tree is also a mother. You know that in Saxony, even now, it is said that beautiful girls grow under the leaves of trees. And I could show you pictures showing that children come from trees. The souls of unborn children rustle under the leaves. And that is why there are trees in the center of all German, Austrian, and Swiss villages. The tree is therefore the great mother. But the tree is not only the mother of life, but also the death mother. Because from trees, coffins are made. And there are the tree burials. The shamans of circumpolar tribes and people in certain North Canadian tribes are buried in a tree. Probably also the Babylonian zikurats and those columns on which Persians put their dead are also a travesty of the tree. Then, have you ever thought of the tree and the well? Under every tree there is a spring. There is a world ash Yggdrasil with the Erd well underneath, for instance. I can show you Babylonian seals on which there's a tree underneath the well of life, so that all the motifs of the water of life are really associated with the tree. You put your searchlight onto it and it just depends on tree mythology. That is quite clear. Everybody sees that. But you can also bring the moon in. As the mother, the tree is feminine, but it is also the father because the tree is a phallic symbol. For instance, in Aztec chronicles, the word for the original land where the Aztecs and Mayans emigrated represents a broken off tree, a kind of tree trunk, and the trunk form is a phallic father image. There are stories of women passing a tree and a seed from the tree entering her womb. Therefore, clearly, the tree is a father, and that links up with the tree being the sun, which is a father figure. That is obvious. If you have a sun complex, then everything is solar, and if you have a moon complex, everything is lunar. In the unconscious, all archetypes are contaminated with one another. So as you can see from this image, we start with just the tree, and we recognize that within the tree archetype, all other archetypes are carried within it. And that goes for all of these. We could find within the Great Mother, the tree archetype. We could find within the phallic symbol of the father, the image of the sun, of the water, of the coffin of death as well. So we can amplify and see that within all archetypes exists all other archetypes. And that's why we're working below the conscious level the intellectual level of the mind. We're no longer in the realm where things make sense to our intellectual mind. We have to start using our right brain, understanding the feelings, the sensations, the emotions of what's happening inside of us. Now, a quote here from Friedrich Nietzsche. Allow this to sort of just like milk. Allow this to kind of just like sit with you as I read this. Every culture that has lost myth has lost, by the same token, its natural healthy creativity. Only a horizon ringed about with myths can unify a culture. The forces of imagination in the Apollonian dream are saved only by myth from indiscriminate rambling. The images of myth must be the demonic guardians, ubiquitous but unnoticed, presiding over the growth of the child's mind and interpreting to the mature man his life and struggles. So that's from Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. And to me, what this image means is every culture has its myth, and whether or not we can consciously see the myth that we're living today, we're living one. And perhaps if we choose or wish to change society, we have to adopt different myths than the ones that we have been living. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, that would really help to get this video into YouTube's algorithm, help to support this work. It's free to do as well, and I really appreciate it. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one, you can schedule a call using the link down below. I'd be happy to chat and see if there's an opportunity to work together. Other than that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you in the next one, all right? Take care.